Hi everyone and welcome to the Integral Podcast. My name is Naeem and today we'll be talking about the South African economy and particularly an IMF bailout and what it means for us. The IMF was established in order to help countries with large payment deficits repay their debt. Proponents of the IMF claim that despite the massive austerity programs, these programs and loans that the IMF gives out leave countries in a more stable fiscal environment and a better outcome going forward. Critics, on the other hand, claim that the debt becomes a drug. So if one looks at Pakistan as an example, Pakistan has approached the IMF 22 times for a loan, most recently in 2019. And what one needs to consider, particularly in the South African context, is that these loans typically drive a wedge between society and bankers. And this is an important consideration for us in South Africa. So what does that mean for the country? Tito Mboweni recently stated that South Africa, because of its large spending and loose fiscal discipline over the past couple of years, now finds itself in a potential sovereign debt crisis. And he said that this leaves us at the door of the IMF. Particularly, in his words, his concerns were that this means that they will then take control of our pension fund and our economy. So today we are joined by Dr. Oscar van Heerden. Dr. van Heerden has a PhD from Cambridge University and is a scholar of international relations. He's also the trustee of the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflections. He writes for the Daily Maverick, and he also has a book entitled 2 Minutes to Midnight, Will Ramaphosa's ANC Survive? This is available at fine bookstores everywhere, and we are delighted to welcome Dr. van Heerden today. Dr. van Heerden, I don't know if you would like to tell us about yourself. I also listened to a talk of you on YouTube where you spoke about your years on the run in the 80s and 90s and your subsequent incarceration. So a colorful history indeed, and we'd love to hear a bit more about yourself.
Well, I hail from the Western Cape, the Cape Flats, as you pointed out. Political consciousness during the tumultuous 80s. Leading up to our breakthrough in 1990 and of course the first democratic elections in 94. A political activist, a social activist. Of course, post 94, we had to go into a different gear, and so we are not so much political activists, but we are certainly social activists trying to contribute to the transformation of the country. And I take a keen interest in these very issues that you were talking about with regards to the South African economy, and of course how that impacts on our triple challenges of poverty, inequality and unemployment. I'm a father, I've got kids, I live in Johannesburg. I'm no longer in Cape Town, I live in Johannesburg. As you said, I write and try and lift my voice weekly in terms of the Daily Maverick articles. Yeah. So yeah, that's me.
I must say, I really enjoy your writing style. It transmits with humor and candor subjects that are actually quite serious, and it's a special gift. So perhaps we can start with the South African economy and understand how we arrive potentially at the door of the IMF. Of course, COVID-19 was simply a gasoline on a fire that was already burning. And in my view, I think that, globally we are unlikely to see V-shaped recoveries and likely to see further weakness. And for a country like South Africa, whose economy was already in desperate need of growth, we now find ourselves on the precipice. So how did we arrive here?
Yeah, I think, firstly, Naeem, we should be aware that, a lot of people associate the IMF with failure. And what I mean by that is that those countries that knock on the door of the IMF and take loans from the IMF, it is presupposed that they have failed in their duties. You would recall when Greece was in its very bad situation in terms of the economy, the European Union was adamant that it should not go to the IMF because they certainly didn't want that kind of reputational branding that one of their own had to go to the IMF. And so Germany and others made sure that they impose similar to a structural adjustment program on the Greek government and on the Greek people. but all to avoid the IMF. And I only mentioned this historically because, you know, people are viewing this latest loan from South Africa from the IMF as a negative. I'm one of those that have always subscribed to the view that we should not go to the IMF. We shouldn't go we didn't have to go and make a loan. And I think that there's other political considerations why the Ramaphosa administration decided to go for the loan at the IMF, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. But suffice to say, historically, the IMF and the kinds of loans that it used to and still does give to borrowers is accompanied by very stringent conditionalities. In the 80s, we know that they spoke of structural adjustment programs and so forth. And I do think it's important to the viewers and the listeners of the podcast to know that that's not the same kind of loan that South Africa made with the IMF. But yeah, it's an unfortunate situation that the Treasury decided to go to the IMF, and I think we need to debunk that a little bit further.
So, you know, if the IMF is not the right place to address what is obvious need in the South African economy for, you know, for potentially an infrastructure program, etc., what do you think the right policy tools are in that case? What other options are available to the government?
For me, Naeem, it's a very simple thing, and most economists agree on this, including Treasury, which is that we need significant structural reform of the economy. And that entails a number of things. What it does mean is that politically, the ANC government, Ramaphosa's government, has to make difficult choices and make difficult decisions. And I think that it was a cop-out, quite frankly, to run to the IMF and make a loan of $4 billion because you don't want to face up to the domestic difficulties and realities back home. So it was convenient for Tito and others to go to the IMF because they don't want to challenge the public sector unions. Two, they don't want to take on what is now traditionally become known as white monopoly capital. Three, they don't want to talk about reform of the stock exchange and other elements that are critical to a thriving democracy, such as the land issue, a more inclusive government, and so on, more inclusive economy, and so on. So the Ramaphosa administration, in not wanting to make the difficult decisions, decided to take the easy way out and go and make a loan. I mean, Naeem, it is just perplexing. Why do you introduce a 500 billion rand stimulus package and then you go to the IMF to make a loan of 70 billion? It just doesn't make any sense, you know, because the 70 billion, as you know, was not part of the initial 500 billion rand stimulus. Now, if you are prepared to take some of the resources that is here in the country and put it towards the plight of not only COVID, but trying to stimulate the economy, it just doesn't make any sense that you then go and make a loan from the IMF. And so therefore, some analysts, economists and so on, and I'm included in that school of thought, suggest that the loan from the IMF has got other political considerations. It's not that we needed that money.
So what would those,
unlike other countries, those considerations is that in the absence of wanting to be politically tough and make the difficult decisions and take public sector unions and a number of other important stakeholders head on, you then make a loan from the IMF in order to use that as the framework and excuse why there needs to be structural adjustment. Because you know, Naeem, you know that if you didn't have that backing, so to speak, from the IMF, you are going to traverse a much more difficult road where the unions, the Federation, COSATU, the Communist Party, and many other players, business included, is going to push back in a very strong way. But now that you've made this loan, which you know you can pay back tomorrow, by the way, because I also want to come to this issue of, I'm digressing, but allow me, in terms of traveling this road of our economic recovery since the 1980s. Let's start there, because you see, people are too quick to have the short-term views, the sensationalism of today. The fact of the matter is that the economy of South Africa was in disarray and in a very putrid state coming out of the 1970s. The 70s were the boom years. ISCO, all these state-owned enterprises were established, the economy was really booming. But the fact of the matter is, as they entered into the 80s, the South African economy waned. It became very, very bad. And by the time we hit 85 to 1990, there's negative growth. There's negative growth. And so this notion, that I always hear from people that says, the ANC or the black government inherited a very stable economy, a very good economy, and they just messed it up. It's absolutely nonsensical. It is simply not true. By the time 1990 happened, de Klerk and his cronies were quite aware that they simply cannot sustain the failing economy any longer. And so what the ANC government inherits is an economy that is non-existent. Sorry, a fiscus, not an economy, a fiscus that is non-existent. It's actually in the negative. There's debt. Now, they take that situation and the fact, I also have to mention that it's very important that by 1993, late 1993, we make a loan from the IMF. The transitional government, because you'll remember, Naeem, the ANC and the National Party formed a transitional government sorts to try and move towards a general election. But by the time they got to 1993, there was no more money. We couldn't even afford to hold a general election. And so we went, the country went to the IMF and made a loan of $850 million US, which then enabled us to do some basic government services, but also to go for an election. And so it is no accident that by 1996, 2 years into our new democracy, the Mbeki, who is the deputy president at the time, together with people like Tito Mboweni and many other economists, had to make the difficult decision. There is no money. Do we go to the IMF and do what every other African country has done post-colonialism, or do we tighten our belts? And that's where gear came into the equation. Contrary to what other leftists and economists would want to argue, that it was a Washington consensus, etc., etc. No, it was a decision that was informed by the fact that there was no money, and we needed to impose our own structural adjustment program. In a sense, we said, people have been suffering for a long time, another 5 years is not going to make a difference. As bad as that sounds. That was the decision of the ANC government in 1996. And we've seen the benefits of that, the positive spin-offs, because for 7 uninterrupted years, there were growth, the economy was picking up. And as independent analysts like JP Landman always say, even if the economy is growing at 1%, it's better than what we did in the 80s, which was negative growth.
Indeed.
And so people are so pessimistic and so negative that they forget the good stories. Because the fact of the matter is, now in 2020, when we are forced, because of the COVID pandemic that has highlighted the social ills of South Africa, because we go to the IMF, it is seen as this big betrayal. When in fact, we are able to make that loan on our own conditions. We have some fiscus to talk about, and therefore the conditionalities weren't as stringent. But I still maintain, Naeem, we shouldn't have gone to the IMF, because the very point you made in your introductory notes, which is that if we fail as a country and as an economy, then the IMF will take our pension funds and take control of those savings. The fact of the matter is, it is precisely because of those savings in the insurance industry, in our pension funds, in our UIF, and so forth, that we are able to actually, we don't have a balance of payment problem. And this is the argument by many. We don't have a balance of payment problem, so why did we go to the IMF?
So Oscar, onto your point about structural reform, I mean, it's clear, I don't think anybody would argue that is probably the panacea for our country. But given the dichotomy within the ANC and the factionalism, I mean, is this not a utopian ideal that we can expect, absent foreign intervention, that this would ever take place? We've had many years where this factionalism plays itself out, and indeed, it's playing itself out till today. And many people would argue that absent a foreign heavy hand, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Mm. Look, I mean, I think it is a bad thing. Let me just start from saying it is a bad thing. I don't think we need any foreign intervention because we need to sort out our own problems. I liken the issue to what's happening in Zimbabwe now, Naeem, where, of course, we do as responsible international players, as South Africa, a neighboring country, we must do our part to try and assist the situation in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean people. But ultimately, the solution of the problems in Zimbabwe is in the hands of the Zimbabwean people. And similarly with us, for me, outside intervention is a very last resort. And as South Africa, we are simply not there. And anyone you talk to on the right or the left will tell you that we are not there. We need to make our own decisions, our own difficult choices to get out of this situation. So what I'm saying is that with the Mandela administration, which was the first 5 years of our democracy, it was about reorientating ourselves financially, reorientating the economy, introducing things like Black economic empowerment legislation and so forth. But it was really under the Mbeki administration that we then had gear. We reorientated ourselves with our approach to the South African economy, and we've made some significant headways. You would know, Naeem, that the South African economy is in a much, much better situation, even with these weaknesses that we are talking of now, than it was 25 years ago, 20 years ago. And so we need to look at the positives. But having said that, you then have a situation where Zuma comes in, and the Zuma administration, over a 9-year period, destroys almost half of those gains that we've made as a country. And that is why, talking to your point about factionalism in the ANC, it was important to stop him and his ilk, these hyenas that the president talks about, these vultures. I call them vultures because if you recall, Naeem, a few years ago on the cover of Time magazine, there was that poignant picture of the pot-belly African child, starving of starvation, etc. And a few meters away is this vulture, just waiting for
the child. They made a movie about that, right?
Exactly. Now the vulture are these corona thieves, these state capture corruptors. That is still within the ANC and is still within our broader society, because they are not only in the ANC, as the popular narrative would like to go. And so we need to root them out.
So how
and so to talking to your point about factionalism, the battle is ongoing in the ANC. We can see it. And much progress is being made.
So how would you respond to people who then, because I seem to infer from what you're saying that potentially we should look at using South African savings pools to facilitate growth and reform. How would you respond to people who say that, if our savings funds and our pension funds are tapped into through prescription, all that will happen is it will be a bigger pool of assets for these hyenas and vultures of which you speak.
For the looters.
Absolutely, and all you'll see is loose fiscal discipline. You'll see increased graft, and what you'll end up with is just more debt over time, and prescription will just increase, and it will lead us onto an even more unsustainable road. Essentially, the argument would be that we would need some, and I suppose coming back to the point, we would need some external hand to ensure that doesn't happen, because the ANC in and of itself is not capable of doing this. And I think we've seen in March, despite Cyril Ramaphosa's rallying cry at the time of the onset of COVID, we still, and his protestations that we wouldn't see corruption. We are now sitting with, the committees and no accountability, and we've seen tremendous graft on the 500 billion that you spoke about. So people would have this concern, and how do you respond to that?
Look, I mean, this is when you start talking about the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. If indeed it's always half empty and you are a pessimist, then that is the logic, the very narrative that you are referring to. When you talk about the glass half full, as I'm usually one of those that are more optimistic, then we have to talk about, you say, I'm not one of those that subscribe to an overt negativity towards the ruling party. What I mean by that is that I'm acutely aware as a political analyst that there was an internal struggle and fight in the ANC as they moved towards their 2017 national conference in Nasrec. And it was a choice of one or two. One, if the Zuma faction wins, and Nkosazana and Dlamini Zuma, who was their candidate, actually won the elections, then we were going to continue with the downward spiral. If, however, the CR17 camp wins and CR becomes the head of the ANC and of the Republic, then there is some glimmer of hope. It doesn't mean all our problems will automatically be solved, but there is hope that we are going to be able to turn the tide. And when you look, for example, Naeem, just recently, a few days ago, JP Landman, an independent analyst and an economist, released a 3-pager, which he did for one of the banks. Let me not mention the name, but for one of the banking groups. Now he talks there in those 3 pages of corruption, of the track record of prosecutions, the NPA forfeiture, the SIU, and so forth, and gives a nice chronology of quite a lot that has happened over the last 18 months, contrary to popular opinion of nothing is happening. Lots of cases, lots of arrests, and so forth. And I would advise people, please go and Google that input from JP Landman. It was released on the 14th of August. And I think it's quite insightful. It's a good read. Having said that, to come back to your point about the logic and the negativity, look, I think that the current Ramaphosa government is doing a lot to try and push back and reverse the ills of corruption and state capture. I don't have to remind people that, since Ramaphosa came in, lots of structural changes in terms of our institutions, which is important. You want to start at the top and work your way down. So, for example, when he came in, the first thing he had to do was to make sure that we remove President Zuma, because Zuma was still the president of the Republic post the ANC conference, as you recall. It took a bit of cajoling and we had to force him to leave, but eventually he resigned on Valentine's Day, thank goodness, in 2018, which then brought Ramaphosa in. The next step was to get rid of about 10 ministers who we clearly knew were bad apples and were part of these hyenas and vultures. And so 10 of them were fired and told to go. Zwane, Van Rooyen, and many others that we can mention, told to go. The next step was your institutions. He had to fire Tom Moyane at SARS. Of course, it was challenged, but eventually the court upheld the decision and said he's incompetent. Like Dudu Moyane, incompetent, as they say. But Toy came into the NPA, Kisbeta came in because Sean Abrahams had to be fired. The point I'm making, Naeem, is that there has been these structural changes, boards of SOEs, lots of executives being prosecuted because of involvement in corruption and so on. Lots of money being retrieved by the asset forfeiture unit. And of course, lots of people being arrested at local government and other levels by the SIU because investigations are underway. Now, of course, these things do take time. It's not like your hundreds of thousands of people that were arrested during the COVID period for breaking some of the regulations. Those are petty issues. The bigger cases where you want it to stick, where you want successful prosecution and people going to prison, you need to take time and be sure of your case. But lots has happened. And this is the point I want to make, that a lot has happened. Now, as far as the ANC is concerned, we know Our people are not stupid. We know that there is contestation in the ANC, in the ruling party. The Secretary General, Ace Magashula, constantly contradicting the President of the Republic and the President of the ANC. But I think that Cyril is trying to play a delicate balance between delivering on the mandate that he has indicated to the electorate, which is to deal with corruption and so forth, and try and lift the economy up. And then, of course, a secondary issue is to try and find unity in the party politically, which is much more difficult, I admit. That one is not an easy one. Yeah.
So within that construct, how does one rein in the unions or do these economic structural reforms that you spoke about? And do you think that, you know, it's quite an exigency and something that, given these wranglings that happen within the ANC, do we have time to see this borne out, or do you think that the move to go to the IMF was a way to catalyze it in a sense within the ANC, a political move by Ramaphosa? That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yes, I do believe it is a way of a catalyst for these things. Unfortunately, no one wants to hear it. You know, we come from a tradition where people are very comfortable with the tripartite alliance between the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and COSATU as a trade union federation. But we all know, those of us that are realists know that that relationship is not going to hold. Some of us have actually argued that it should break up because it is retarding progress in the country. I'm one of those. And so a decision, when I talk of difficult decisions, Naeem, the President Ramaphosa must decide, even though he comes from the trade union movement and he grew up in the National Union of Mine Workers, etc. The fact of the matter is that that so-called vanguard of the people don't have the interest of the people at heart. They only serve the interest of their members. We've seen it time and time again. I mean, when, because of COVID, when private sector companies are right-sizing, downsizing, firing, retrenching, half pay, etc., all these measures to try and cope with the situation, we have public sector unions that demand an increase, and they are insisting on it, or otherwise they will bring the country to a standstill. And I'm saying it's high time that we have a government that is able to bite the bullet and say, well, then bring the country to a standstill. Because the people are suffering and are having such deprivation that if you have an ongoing labor or industrial action that is negatively impacting on them, I think that the people will decide and say, you know what, there's something wrong with these unions. They don't actually serve our interests. They only look for themselves. And I think that the people will be more in line with the decision of government and with Ramaphosa's presidency than the unions.
So, you know, I can wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. If that is something that we can achieve, then I think an IMF bailout is certainly not necessary. And in fact, you know, I think it changes the entire zeitgeist about whether or not, you know, the discussions around prescribed assets and public-private participation in the economy will be far better received in the event that we do see these kinds of reforms. So I think on that score, we absolutely align. And in that case, there is no need for external intervention.
And also, Naeem, sorry, just to add one other point. You know, when I said the whole issue about negative and positive, I'm yet to meet someone objectively that tells me that the way the ANC government has managed the economy, let's forget about corruption. You know, we're on the corruption index. We know that there's a problem with corruption and so forth, but we must distinguish between corruption and a capable state, because I think a lot of the ills and wrongs of local government is not so much that there's corruption, but it's because they are unqualified. They're idiots. And so they don't know how to manage. That's why we have potholes and maintenance problems and so forth. It's not obvious that that is as a result of corruption. And I think it's very important to make that point. But I wanted to say that, you know, in terms of the issue of corruption versus a capable state, the management of the economy over the last 26 years, I think, has been responsible. And so you don't then take corruption and say, because of this problem, which is a problem and a challenge, we can't actually say that the economy is, people are making lots and lots of money and have been making lots of money over the last 20 years. Companies that has been restricted because of sanctions, etc., are making oodles of profits, and so forth. And so if you look at the JSE and how it has grown exponentially in terms of bottom lines for the top, let's say, 50 companies, the truth of the matter is that there has been responsible management of the economy. Even, and I want to mention an uncomfortable truth, Naeem, even during Zuma's corruption and state capture, that administration was able to grow the foreign reserves of the country. Even during those wasted 9 years, the foreign reserves actually grew by a certain percentage point.
Given that our debt increased from about 30% of GDP to 60%, I think that it was last year particularly, I think that started in 2009 at the onset almost of Zuma's tenure. I mean, how does that square with responsible governance and fiscal discipline?
Well, the truth of the matter is, the way I would answer that is that we have to look at internationally. I don't think there's any country, including the biggest economy in the world, the United States, that haven't increased their debt levels. Because remember, we came out of a international financial crisis, capitalism actually in a crisis in 2008, 2009, which everyone is conveniently forgetting, where there was massive job losses, and you combine COVID, the pandemic, with this catastrophic event, and the entire world is in a financial crisis. Comparable countries like Mexico and many others have exponentially increased their debt, their foreign debt levels. We were still quite okay prior to COVID going in, where we were hovering at about 60%. Of course, the projections now, post-COVID, is going to be that we are going to be well over the 80%. And if we don't have some corrective measures, we might well go over the 100% by 2020 something, 2024, 2027, somewhere there. I don't think we'll get there. I think that we will responsibly intervene, both private and public sector. And we will reprioritize and reorientate, because remember, there's talk of a plan. Now, Naeem, you know and I know, we have no shortage of understanding the economic problematique of South Africa. The OECD countries have just recently, in the last 2 weeks, released an economic report on South Africa, which succinctly analyzes the state of affairs in terms of the South African economy, but also gives very, very credible recommendations as to what needs to happen going forward. Secondly, a month or so ago, Colin Coleman, former executive of Goldman Sachs, released a 10-point plan, which I have looked at and I agree with wholeheartedly. I think that if we can implement such a plan, we are well on our way to a recovery. And it starts out with one of the uncomfortable issues, which is that we need a social wage for the unemployed, for the poorest of the poor. We need a basic income grant. Now, the Minister of Social Development has intimated that they've now decided that that should happen. I think that the President will probably announce it in the opening of Parliament next year, and Treasury will give some credence to that. I think it is critically important to try and just equalize the deprivation that is there within the country. And then, of course, there is a process of having to now go into those structural reforms that we just spoke about to try and make the country recover. So I think that we understand the problem. One, we know what needs to be done. We've gone to the IMF as a catalyst to try and use it as a bulwark to try and push through these reforms that is required. And I think the President has already said to us and has demonstrated that indeed Eskom is going to be broken up into 3. SAA is going to be no more. Whether we want to talk of the pros and cons of a new airline, that's a debatable point for another time. But the point is that never before have we come to a point where we've placed SAA under business rescue and are now actually talking about the airline disappearing because it has become a black hole for taxpayers' monies and so forth. And I think all public sector unions in those industries, both in terms of the airline aviation as well as in Eskom, and Denel, Transnet, etc., are acutely aware that at some point or the other, corrective measures are going to come.
So, how do you propose that the fiscus affords something like a basic income grant, as an example? I mean, you did intimate using pots of savings that because South Africa has 6 trillion in savings just in the retirement industry alone, in the savings industry, and you mentioned things like the UIF, etc. I think I've read you argue for wealth tax, without getting into the same discussion about whether or not this will actually be used in a responsible manner and it will fall foul of corruption. How does one implement that? And South Africa needs a new social fabric. Our levels of inequality are embarrassingly high. Do you think that is something that is palatable to the South African populace?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think 2 things for me. The one is to dispel the notion of dependency. It has been proven throughout the world that social wage and or easing the plight of the poorest of the poor doesn't create a dependency syndrome. People want their dignity in place and they want to get work. And so if you can, whilst you provide the social assistance, create an economy that is creating jobs, people will opt for that. People are not in the business of wanting to voluntarily subjugate themselves and just get handouts. In the absence of the meaningful work and jobs, of course, they're not going to say no, thank you, for some form of assistance. So I think that is an important point to raise. The second thing about the cost of the basic income grant or the social wage, there is so many, you've intimated, Naeem, there's so many options open to us. It's not so much that we go and raid the savings. That's one element. We could take some money, reprioritize from the savings, from, for example, public sector pension, redirect some of the life savings and insurance savings that we have in the country. But I don't think government is there. I don't think government is there. That is a last resort. That's what Argentina did a few years ago and defaulted and had to go to the IMF. No, I think what we can do is reprioritize budgets of government. There's huge wastage within government. You would know that the Auditor General has found massive billions of rands of fruitless and wasteful expenditure on the part of local government. So a reprioritize of budgets, that's the first thing. The second thing is, as Colin Coleman outlines in his 10-point plan, we can look at our tax regime and reorganize, re-engineer some of the things within the current tax regime, without increasing VAT and without increasing personal income tax and without increasing company tax. He puts a formula forward that says we can actually generate the 144 billion rand that is required for such a social assistance program. And I'm saying that those kind of creative, out-of-the-box thinking is what we need to be engaged in to make sure that we actually get to that point. And then lastly is exactly the point you're raising, which is that should we introduce a wealth tax? The president has intimated that we need a sovereign wealth fund. We now know that we have a solidarity fund because of COVID. Maybe that post-COVID, once we have a vaccine, should be transformed into some kind of a wealth tax where people generously give, and our people are giving. We saw it now during the pandemic. I think a lot of people in the middle class, upper middle class, and the bourgeoisie are more than happy to contribute towards something that is going to alleviate the pain of the bottom 1%. And the reason they're going to do it is because it is so obvious what the logical conclusion is. If we don't provide social assistance, if we don't provide social grants, etc., in the absence of meaningful jobs, then we are going to have social unrest. We are going to have people protesting and demanding and land seizures and. So it's not rocket science. I think everyone and the very wealthy in the country also knows that if they can contribute to such a fund that is going to be administered properly, and it doesn't have to be wholly administered by government, because we've seen examples throughout the world where it can be a partnership with the private sector. One or two of the big banks can be the administrators of the fund, and so on and so forth. And we're already beginning to see that kind of cooperation. For example, with the disbursements now of the social grants that we are providing for more or less 17 million citizens of South Africa, the big banks are the administrators of that money. in terms of dispersing it and so forth and so on. So there are models that we can work with. I don't think that it is an impossibility. I think that the country is financially in a state where they can provide basic income grant. And remember, it is important to note that it is not a permanent solution. Ultimately, we must work to grow the economy and create jobs so that people actually have meaningful jobs. And the thing is that as soon as you enter into a meaningful job, your social assistance falls away. That is the model that I think will work, because you then register, you are a taxpayer. As soon as we see that you are now gainfully employed, your social assistance falls away. And if you then lose your job, you then fall onto the UIF. And if you fall outside of the UIF, you reapply to be on the social assistance program. That's how the model should work.
I think we're well aligned on that thinking. There's, often people bemoan the fact that we spend a large amount of our revenue on social grants, and I'm always quick to point out that that's kind of buying your freedom. The reality is that there are a lot of people in this country that absolutely do require that assistance. And
you see what happened in Brazil, Naeem, if I could just make the Brazilian example, yes. What people refer to as the Lula moment. What Lula did was, he realized, of course, they have a much larger population in Brazil than us. But what he realized that if he's just going to say a war on poverty, he's going to lose that war because there's too many people that are poor. And so what he did was he then said, let's look at a definition for abject poverty. And he gave an arbitrary definition, something, and this is not the right figure, but it was something to the extent of any family that earns less than $5 a month falls in the category of abject poverty. And so then they got a number. So many million Brazilians fall in that category, and it says that's what we're going to target. And we are now going to provide them with something as little as $25 per month. But by virtue of doing that to, let's say, a hypothetical figure of 20 million Brazilians, he lifted them completely out of poverty, narrowed the inequality gap, and made those people to become active economically by spending that money. And so a similar approach must happen with South Africa, I think.
Yeah, I don't think many would be averse to contributing to that, even if it would be in the form of a wealth tax. If we could see, I think by benefiting the poorest of the poor in the country, it benefits all of us, and it puts us on a much more sustainable trajectory going forward. I think the reticence would obviously be surrounding the current state of the ruling party, but we've had that discussion, and in the absence of any misadministration of those funds, I don't, I struggle to see how most people would be opposed to it. So, Oscar, I think if we can go back to, I think we understand your views quite well in terms of why you are averse to an IMF program. And I think, I certainly agree with you that if we can solve our own problems, there really is no need to get external parties involved. But should we play devil's advocate for a second and just assume that we are unable to do that? If we were to go on to the structural adjustment program of the IMF, what do you think our experience as a country would be, and which country's experience would we most likely follow?
Well, if for example, and that's a very cogent, a very, very interesting eventuality, but let's go along with the devil's advocate. If we default on our repayments, remember, it's not only the IMF. It's let's say 4.5 billion of US dollars from the IMF, 1 billion from the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS Bank, and then a further 1 billion from the African Development Bank. Let's say we default on all of those. We're not able to pay back. We then have to borrow from ourselves and to dig into our savings, which is public pension, plus reprioritization. It's not going to be enough. And the country then basically implodes. We have a balance of payment problem. Okay. A lot of people will tell you, and I'm one of those, it will take a long time before we get there, and we have to monumentally mess up but let's go with that and say we now have a balance of payment problem. I think that it would be catastrophic for South Africa. It would be catastrophic because private sector simply is going to not be able to generate the necessary capital to continue surviving. There'll be mass unemployment. There will be no social grants, because that will be the first thing that will go. You know, knowing the IMF, that's the first thing that they will scrap. There's no point in having social assistance to the population because we can't afford it. Defense budgets will be cut. Health, education will be cut. People will lose jobs. It will be a very, very miserable situation. And to be honest with you, Naeem, I can't even think of what the ultimate consequence will be, except to say that we would probably arrive at, I don't know, we would probably arrive at a situation where we can then talk of, what is it called, you know, the depiction of hell by Dante. But we will get to that Dante moment where everything is just everything is just bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Dante's Inferno.
That's it.
Yeah,
Dante's Inferno.
that's it. Yeah. We will get to Dante's Inferno.
Yeah. So I suppose, you know, when you read the headlines of what a structural adjustment program hopes to achieve, things like reductions in debt to GDP ratios, reduction in civil servant wage bill, free market reforms, these generally sound like good things. But you know, when you think about it a bit more deeply and you understand that potentially you have a reduction in social spending, you know, social grants, for the reasons we articulated earlier, why that could be very bad from a you know, civil unrest point of view, I suppose it does start looking like a very bad outcome for our, you know, our idiosyncratic case. Certainly, as a country, we potentially need something a bit more nuanced like that. So your objections wouldn't be around, it doesn't sound to me like your objections are around the philosophical right to sovereignty. I mean, you certainly are more practically thinking about this, more practically along the lines of what is, you know, achievable if we just got our act together. We quite some way from this. You did mention something earlier that I just thought I'd come back to you. You said there are potential JSE reforms that you think could be made to help with our current predicament. Do you care to elaborate on those, please?
Well, I mean, what I refer to in terms of JSE reform is about the structure of the economy, the ownership patterns of our economy. Now, you know, one of the things where I don't necessarily agree with those in the ANC that argue for the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. I don't, but I do subscribe to a notion or an argument that says the mandate of the bank needs to be elaborated. It needs to expand. Similarly with the JSE, you know, it's not good enough for the JSE to just continue in the manner in which they are when the ownership patterns of the top 50 companies, for example, remains largely white. Now, a lot of people would argue and have been arguing that the PIC, as a pension fund, owns quite a substantial portion of the economy, of the JSE, I should say, the stock exchange. And this is true. This is true. However, that point doesn't negate the fact that we still have very skewed ownership patterns. And so the JSE and the administration of the stock exchange can go some way in wanting to assist in ensuring that the ownership patterns of the economy shifts in a significant way to reflect the demographics of the country. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It will take time, but at least if there is some measure of an attempt to say, how do we assist companies, how do we assist those players within the economy to actually make sure that we begin to see a change on the ownership patterns? I think that would be a good way forward for the Johannesburg Stock Exchange.
And do you not think that the current BE programs that a lot of the listed companies have undertaken and continue to undertake are a means to an end, or do you think that, you know, it's not happening as expeditiously as it should?
Look, I mean, I think there's been some gains, definitely through the BE legislation. There has been some gains, but we also know a lot of people have abused it, and it's become sort of a window dressing exercise.
Absolutely.
You know, you have 2, 3 black candidates as the face of the organization and so on. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you find that actually there hasn't been a significant substantive ownership exchange within those companies. So I think we have a long way still to go in terms of redress. And I think that the Reserve Bank, the JSE, can play a much more active role in actually facilitating that kind of change, which I do think is important.
And for custodians of capital like ourselves, asset managers who are entrusted with looking after people's pension funds and their savings and investing it in a way that is most advantageous to them. And I use that term carefully because that doesn't necessarily mean that short-term returns are the most advantageous thing. We at Differential, we're always looking at a better South Africa for all and creating a more sustainable economy. So, over the long term, we generate more returns. A classic example that we like to highlight is we'd rather not invest in a company that is deleterious to society, and the company itself will generate great returns, and you may get a great return from that particular company, but the reality is you're detracting from all your other investments because of the extractive nature of that company. So, what advice would you give the asset management community, and what role do you think we could play better in helping our society achieve these goals and reforming our society? To stand up as a collective against corruption is probably the most obvious. But practically, what suggestions do you have for us?
Sure, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, as you rightfully point out, responsible investment is critical. But obviously, that something that goes apart with that is obviously ethical and moral investment. I think that is critically important. I heard, for example, on NBCA and a number of other American CNN and so forth, talking to asset managers, and it was very difficult for some of them to not see the advantages of this current pandemic. Saying things like, obviously, we need to invest in some of the tech companies because that's where the boom is. More and more people now are living virtually, and so you need to invest in that if you want some return on investment and so forth. And the question is that really the only thing that you are concerned about, which is the bottom line and making more money when we are dealing with a pandemic and so forth? So I think it's about ethical and moral investment, firstly, but also, two, it's about corporate social investment, corporate social responsibility. What can we do with the little extra that we make to try and affect change in broader society? And I think often people in the financial sector think that money should only circulate within that sector. So it's a reinforcing cycle, but I think that a lot can be done with extra money that can make a change in various communities. And so I think that is the best thing that asset managers can do with some of the profits that they make, is to say, in terms of corporate social investment, where is the greater need? Where can we make an impact? And what can we do to change things?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think we're very much aligned in our thinking that it's absolutely an imperative that we all need to take quite seriously. Oscar, I think that we're out of time, and I don't want to keep you too much longer. And everyone at Differential thanks you for a very interesting conversation. I don't know if you'd like to make any closing remarks, but certainly we've appreciated it, and we hope to host you again soon. I think your views may ruffle some feathers in the sense that a lot of people might hold the view that the ANC is endemically corrupt and beyond saving. But you did mention you're a glass half full kind of guy, and I've certainly taken some of the things you said to heart, and I feel better about the state of our country having had this conversation. But yeah.
Thanks for the opportunity, Naeem. I mean, just two final points. One is on the ANC issue. Let me just talk about that very quickly, which is that people always say the ANC must lose an election, and perhaps that will be the best thing for the country. I'm one of the people that believe that in the absence of a reputable, responsible, and credible alternative political party, which I can vote for in the next election, I think it is very dangerous to just wish for the ANC to implode, because we will be in political limbo. We all know whether, I mean, it's a debatable point, and I'm more than happy to talk about it in future, but the DA in its current state is not able to run the country, nor is the EFF. And so to wish for the ANC to just implode and lose an election will really throw our country into a very dangerous situation. And so I think what we should be advocating for is for a credible alternative party to emerge so that we can strengthen our democracy. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I want to conclude by saying, Naeem, that our triple challenges, as identified as early on as 1990 already, unemployment, inequality, and poverty, those are the three wars that we are having to fight. These corruption is a distraction. We need to deal with it effectively and root it out so that we can concentrate on the priorities, which is these three challenges, to get our country on a good footing and rebuild it so that we can be a proud nation. And I think that is what I would encourage everyone to focus on, and not get sidetracked with these vultures and hyenas. Not that we must ignore them, we must bring them to book. The long arm of the law will take its course, and I am confident that they will indeed be arrested, prosecuted, and jailed. I have no doubt about that. It will take a bit of time, of course. But I think as citizens, we must become change agents and ask, what is it that I can do? Besides the government, what can I do to make a change? I'm currently on the view that, you know, my contribution is about what I call lifting voices. I'm lifting my voice. I'm contributing to a critical discourse, albeit through the Daily Maverick and other platforms. But it is important to be participating in the think industry, where we strategically engage, like we just did, about the critical issues and what we can do to actually solve them. So I want to say thank you for this opportunity.
No, it's my pleasure, and I think those are wise words indeed, and certainly something to hold here. I think we certainly need to ask ourselves what we can do. And indeed, if we do see some incarcerations, I think it will change the entire mood of the country, and hopefully, you know, that will in itself be a catalyst for that kind of thinking. What can I do to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem? Oscar, thanks very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you, Naeem, and let's have another one like this.
Indeed, it would be our pleasure.